Escher's father was a civil engineer? Yes, George Arnold Escher was the chief engineer for a government bureau. Now you understand. He was the type of man who spent his working life solving the problems that buildings pose when you take them seriously as physical objects that have to stand up in a real world that is always trying to pull them down. His son Maurits grew up in the presence of this type of thinking. Space was a problem to be solved. Structure was a question with precise answers. Curious as so often children live their life rebelling against the whole narrative of their parent. When Maurits Escher failed out of school, his father sent him to architecture school. Of course he did. Architecture school at Haarlem lasted, for Escher, approximately a week before he discovered graphic arts and switched. He found a way to do his own will, and he found it in woodcut and stayed. The failed architecture student became the artist, whose work hangs in the offices of architects worldwide. The son of the civil engineer became the man who built buildings that 0 civil engineers could construct and 0 physical laws could sustain. Escher knew his buildings. He knew them well enough to make them wrong in exactly the right place, to commit the geometric crime with the surgical precision that only deep familiarity with the law makes possible. You have to understand how columns work before rebelling against them. The violation requires the knowledge. The 12 years he spent in Italy, between his 20s and mid-30s, were the years that filled the architecture school with content. He travelled obsessively. The Amalfi Coast, Calabria, Sicily, the hill towns of the interior, the medieval villages cascading down cliffs above the sea, sketching buildings and townscapes with the devotion of someone who had found the visual world they had been looking for their whole life. The Mediterranean light on stone, the way the buildings of an old town pile on top of each other following the topography of the hill they inhabit over the preferences of a planner. He drew all of it. He loved all of it. He married an Italian woman, had children in Rome, and settled into what he believed would be a life. Then Mussolini's fascists required his 9-year-old son Giorgio to wear the Balilla uniform, the youth movement of the fascist state, to school. Escher packed up the family and left. He had 0 interest in politics and even less in ideology. But the requirement that his son's body be dressed in the symbols of a system he found contemptible was the outrage that converted an aversion to fascism into a departure from Italy. He went to Switzerland, then Belgium, then eventually back to the Netherlands, the northern landscape of his childhood. Grey, flat, precise, a world away from the Amalfi Coast. His work changed. The observation stopped. The field sketches stopped. The printmaking that had been driven by the encounter with actual places, cliffs, villages, light at a particular hour in a particular location, was replaced by work generated completely from inside, from the geometric and spatial imagination that the Italian years had developed, and that the exile had liberated from its dependency on external reference. He called these images his mindscapes. The word is exact and sad simultaneously. The landscape turned inward, the external world internalized because the external world was now unavailable. The impossible buildings are mindscapes. They are the architecture that exists in the mind of a person who has loved real buildings intensely and been separated from them. They have the quality of all intense memory, more vivid than the original, hyper-articulated, freed from the limitations of actual physics because the mind that holds them is freed from the limitations of actual physics. Atrani appears in the Metamorphosis prints as a phase in a transformation. The impossible buildings are what the Mediterranean architecture became when it moved completely inside, recognizably Italian. The arches, the stone, the medieval massing. But now operating in a space that follows the rules of the imagination over the preferences of structural engineering. Escher's impossible buildings are inhabited. They are full of people going about their daily lives, climbing stairs, carrying loads, sitting in courtyards, looking out windows, with the complete composure of people who have 0 idea that the building they inhabit is geometrically insane. The people belong there, the building is their home. The building is wrong and the people are at home in it. Piranesi's prison prints hung in his studio. Piranesi's carceri d'invenzione, his imaginary prisons, are the direct ancestor of Escher's impossible buildings. Vast architectural spaces full of staircases going in every direction. Arches opening onto more arches. The vertiginous sense of an enclosed infinity. Tiny human figures dwarfed by the stone that surrounds them. Piranesi was interested in the prison as an image of the mind trapped in its own constructions. The self-made enclosure, the architecture of compulsion. Escher admired these prints and had several in his studio, which means he was sitting with them while he made his own impossible buildings. And the impossible buildings he made are in some sense the answer to Piranesi's question, what does it look like when the trap is invisible? When the prison has the appearance of a perfectly normal medieval building, with columns and arches and staircases that look completely functional, and the trap is only visible when you try to understand the whole. Ascending and descending arrived after the Penroses sent him their impossible staircase, and Escher knew immediately what to do with it because he had been circling the same question from his end for years. The print placed the impossible staircase at the top of a large institutional building, a monastery or a school or a government complex, a place where people live by rules and schedules, and populated it with 2 processions of monks in identical tunics, one going clockwise and one counterclockwise, ascending and descending in endless loops. The staircase is the Penrose staircase. Each step is higher than the previous one. The loop is closed, and the arrival is perpetual. Escher described this print as a sad, pessimistic subject, as well as being profound and absurd. The monks represent, in his own account, the futility of effort that appears directional, the busyness that substitutes for progress, the institutional life that mistakes movement for meaning. The marching monks are every committee that meets every week and produces zero change, every career that is advanced because careers are advanced, every box that is ticked because boxes are ticked, every floor that is cleaned because floors are cleaned, with zero interrogation of whether the activity connects to any destination beyond the activity itself. 2 figures in the print have declined to march. One sits in a courtyard. One stands on a lower staircase. Escher wrote of them, recalcitrant individuals refuse, for the time being, to take part in the exercise of treading the stairs. They have zero use for it. Sooner or later they will be brought to see the error of their nonconformity. The phrase, for the time being, is the cruelest thing in any Escher print. It acknowledges the rebellion and immediately contextualizes it as temporary. The structure will win, the institution will absorb the recalcitrant. The staircase is patient, and the individuals have very little patience. Escher, the reclusive artist who had spent his career working in isolation, ignored by the institutional art world that was busy with expressionism and abstract expressionism, and every other movement that had decided its emotional temperature was the correct one. Escher knew exactly what the recalcitrant figures were for and what was going to happen to them. His own relationship to institutions was famously difficult. He was anxious, reclusive, irritable, prone to locking himself in his studio for days at a time, furious at interruption. He described the development of each new print as a process of consistent disappointment. His first proofs were always worse than he had hoped, and he struggled through the gap between the image in his mind and the image on the paper with the tenacity of someone who had decided that the gap was always going to be unacceptable and was going to be closed regardless of how long it took. The monks climbing the impossible staircase are, among everything else, the process of making a print, the repetitive effort, the constant return to the same staircase, the sense that each step is slightly higher than the previous one, and the structure that the effort is building has zero guaranteed destination. He knew this feeling intimately. He put it in a print. Belvedere is the building that is most architectural in its intelligence and most personal in its implication. The impossible columns, the front left column of the lower floor, becoming the back right column of the upper floor, turning the building inside out between levels, are the work of a man who knows buildings well enough to commit exactly the right crime. The building looks completely correct at every point of local examination. It fails catastrophically at the global level. This is the spatial intelligence of the civil engineer's son. He found the precise logical point at which the building can be made to misbehave while maintaining the appearance of perfect structural integrity. And he executed the misbehavior with impeccable craft. Waterfall, the last of the major impossible architecture prints, is the one where the humour is most fully and most transparently present. A watermill runs on a perpetual motion machine. The water falls from the top of the tower, turns the wheel, flows along the descending channel, and returns to the top to fall again, forever. Escher included a note that the machine would require periodic additions of water to compensate for evaporation. This note is one of the great dry jokes in the history of printmaking, a man performing maintenance, on a thermodynamically forbidden device, topping up the water in a perpetual motion machine, because evaporation is the one thing that might actually stop it. This is the act of a person who has been building things whose existence is thermodynamically forbidden, for long enough that maintaining them feels like ordinary housekeeping. He worked in an almost complete self-generated isolation for most of his mature career. The correspondence with Penrose and Coxeter and the mathematicians was the exception. The art world's attention was largely absent until late. He was nearly 70 before the Netherlands held its first major retrospective. This is a long time to be a recalcitrant figure in the courtyard while the procession climbs above you. He sat in his studio in Barn and made his buildings, and the buildings were impossible, and the buildings were exact, and the buildings held in their impossible geometry the full weight of what it means to understand what the room around you has yet to understand, and to keep working. And anyway, because the work is the work and the staircase is the staircase, and you are going to keep climbing, even if the climbing leads nowhere. Even if the nowhere is the point, even if the building you are climbing toward is the building you are already inside. The single most illuminating thing about how Escher made his impossible buildings is that he described the entire process as one of consistent, almost disciplined disappointment. He wrote that the first proof was always worse than the image in his mind, that the gap between what he could see internally and what the stone or the woodblock would yield was a recurring ordeal he learned to outlast. The woodcuts he annotated by hand with the word Eigendruk, a Dutch compound meaning something close to by my own pressure. Escher printed all of his own woodcuts, having no apprentice, and many of his larger pieces bear this annotation, his own hands. The Amsterdam encounter in 1954 is where the story properly starts, and it happened the way the best creative collisions happen, by accident. In a crowd, at an event where everyone was there for something else. The International Congress of Mathematicians met in Amsterdam that year, and a display of Escher's work was organised at the Stedelijk Museum for the participants. Penrose walked in and was, by his own account, absolutely spellbound. He went home to England and began trying to produce something impossible of his own. What followed is one of the most productive feedback loops in the history of either art or mathematics. Inspired by Escher's work, Penrose devised the impossible triangle, and his father Lionel produced the impossible staircase, the continuously ascending loop. They published both in the British Journal of Psychology in 1958 and sent Escher a copy as a token of their esteem. Escher received the article and was consumed by the staircase. He wrote to his son Arthur in January 1960 with the excitement of a man who has been given the precise tool he had been trying to invent. I am busy designing a new print showing a staircase that goes on endlessly ascending, or descending, depending on your perspective. This would normally have to be a spiralling thing in which the top would disappear into the clouds and the bottom into hell. Not in my version. It is a sealed, annular affair. In April 1960, he wrote back to Roger and Lionel Penrose thanking them for their invention and enclosed a print of ascending and descending. The loop was closed. Escher had inspired Penrose. Penrose had given Escher the staircase. Escher had built the monks into the staircase and sent it back to the mathematician who had sent him the staircase. A creative exchange across disciplines, conducted through the post, producing in 3 exchanges one of the most recognised images of the 20th century. The Penroses sent him their triangle next, and Escher used it repeatedly in Waterfall, the lithograph of a building that appears to function as a perpetual motion machine. The mathematician provided the geometric object. The printmaker populated it with water and gravity and the sound of a wheel turning forever. The crystallographer H.S.M. Coxeter was the other significant figure in this period, and his relationship with Escher was warmer and stranger than the Penrose correspondence. Coxeter obtained Escher's permission to use 2 of his drawings in his paper on crystal symmetry, sent Escher a copy, and Escher recorded that Coxeter's figure of a hyperbolic tessellation gave me quite a shock. The shock was the shock of recognition. Escher had been trying to solve the problem of the infinite in a finite circle, and Coxeter's mathematical figure showed him exactly how. He studied the paper carefully, marked it up, worked out the geometry by eye, and sent Coxeter a diagram of his analysis. Coxeter confirmed it was correct. In 1959, Coxeter published his finding that the resulting woodcuts were extraordinarily accurate. Escher got it absolutely right to the millimetre. The man who believed he had zero mathematical ability had worked out the mathematics of hyperbolic tiling by looking at it, and the mathematician confirmed the working was correct to the millimetre. This is what happens when visual intelligence of sufficient depth meets a problem that has a spatial structure. The intelligence finds the answer through different means, and the answer is the same answer. His teacher at the Haarlem school, the printmaker Samuel Gesserun de Mesquita, was the person who recognised what was happening early and redirected it. De Mesquita saw what the boy could do with a gouge and a burin, and how naturally he thought in terms of the cut surface. The world as the woodblock sees it, as the negative of the cut, as the relationship between what is removed and what remains. This is the grammar of all Escher's impossible buildings. They are defined by absence as much as by presence. De Mesquita remained a close friend until his murder at Auschwitz in 1944, a loss that Escher described as devastating, one of the griefs of his life. And the friendship between the young printmaker and his older teacher was one of the few relationships in Escher's characteristically isolated adult life that carried genuine warmth across decades. He said of his objects, "I feel like telling my objects, you are too fictitious, lying there next to each other static and frozen. Do something. Come off the paper and show me what you are capable of." He was frustrated by the flatness of representation. The mathematicians who found him described the encounter with his work in terms that are almost anthropological, the sense of recognising in a foreign tradition the same problems their own tradition was pursuing. Albert Flocon, the art historian and artist who became a close friend and correspondent, identified Escher as a thinking artist alongside Leonardo, Dürer and Piero della Francesca, the tradition of painters and draftsmen for whom making an image was also doing philosophy. He said in an interview, "I was a pretty poor pupil at school, and just imagine, mathematicians now use my prints to illustrate their books. The civil engineer's son who learned to build impossible things with the precision his father's discipline required, who was exiled from the architecture he loved and turned it into the architecture of the interior, who drew recalcitrant figures in courtyards with the sympathetic irony of a man who knew what they were refusing and knew what would happen to them." He asked the question and left it open. Because a question left open is the one type of structure that is free of the impossibility problem, the only building that is allowed to have a staircase that leads somewhere.